The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the lush backyard as the black CEO leaned back in his poolside lounge chair, sipping on a drink. He had earned this moment of peace. His company was thriving, and this mansion, this life, was proof of his success. But that peace was about to be shattered. A subtle tension hung in the air when he noticed a worker in the corner of his eye, a landscaper who had stopped his work and was looking at him with an expression that said everything: doubt, disbelief, and a deep-rooted assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly belong here. The CEO met his gaze, his smile not faltering, but a flicker of something darker crossing his mind. It was the same look he'd encountered before, again and again in his rise to the top. The assumption that a black man could never truly have the life he had. As the landscaper shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, the CEO stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "You're wrong," he said, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. Just 2 words. Simple. Yet enough to break the tension in the air and make the world around him stop for a moment. But this was just the beginning. What would happen next would test not only his resilience but his very belief in what it meant to succeed in a world that was never meant for him. To understand how far he would go to prove everyone wrong, to shatter the stereotypes, you'll have to keep watching. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the lush backyard as the black CEO leaned back in his poolside lounge chair, savoring a quiet moment of peace. His company was flourishing, and this mansion, this life, was the proof of his success. But that peace was short-lived. An uneasy tension lingered in the air when he noticed a landscaper in the corner of his eye standing still, staring at him. The look in the worker's eyes wasn't admiration, it was disbelief, the kind of gaze that questioned how someone like him could ever belong here. The CEO locked eyes with him, his smile unwavering, but something inside him shifted. He had seen this look before, a look that said, "You don't belong." It was the same assumption he'd been fighting against his entire career, the belief that a black man couldn't possibly have the life he had. Slowly, he rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked toward the landscaper, his posture exuding quiet strength. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low but clear. 2 words. Simple. Yet enough to stop the man in his tracks. In that moment, the tension in the air thickened. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. The real battle, the one that would test his resolve and challenge everything he stood for, was just starting. If you want to know how he'd face the doubts and the prejudice head-on, keep watching. The following day, the tension from the previous afternoon still hung in the air like a heavy fog, but the black CEO had little time to dwell on it. He was in the middle of preparing for an important meeting with potential investors, people who would determine the future of his company. The world he had built from nothing rested on this meeting, and he knew that it was not just about closing a deal. This was about breaking through barriers, smashing stereotypes, and proving that a man like him had earned every ounce of his success. As he arrived at the sleek, glass-walled conference room, he noticed the uneasy glances from some of the executives already seated. These were the same people who had always questioned his place in the industry. They were polite, of course, but their subtle condescension was unmistakable. The CEO took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and walked into the room with quiet confidence. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. The investors, a mix of older white men, exchanged a few words before one of them, Richard, the lead investor, spoke up, his voice dripping with thinly veiled skepticism. "I hope you've come prepared," he said, glancing over the CEO's shoulder at the sleek portfolio in his hands. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? For someone of your background." The comment was casual, but it cut deep, a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be people who viewed him through the lens of race. The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't flinch. He had heard worse. "I came prepared," he said, his voice steady. "And my background doesn't define my ability to lead this company." The tension in the room was palpable. Richard's eyes briefly flickered to the other investors, a silent challenge. "Well, we'll see about that." The meeting proceeded, but the undertones of racial prejudice were clear. Every proposal the CEO put forward was met with doubt, every suggestion questioned. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this level of resistance. He had built his empire in the face of adversity, constantly fighting against a world that wanted to box him in. But today, it felt different. The weight of every racist assumption, every doubt about his competence, pressed on him with unbearable force. At one point, another investor, Sarah, casually asked him about his family background, trying to subtly suggest that his success was more about luck than skill. "Tell us," she said, "how did your family support you in your journey?" The question seemed innocent enough, but the underlying implication was clear. Did his family help him, or was he really capable of achieving this success on his own? He paused, took a deep breath, and answered with measured calm. "My family taught me the value of hard work, resilience, and never taking no for an answer. They didn't hand me anything. I earned it all." The room fell silent for a moment. Sarah's expression shifted, a mixture of discomfort and realization crossing her face. But the CEO wasn't done. He continued, making his point loud and clear. "And I didn't get here because of any special treatment, favoritism, or because of the color of my skin. I got here because I am damn good at what I do." His words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration of defiance against the biases he knew would continue to haunt him. He could see the shift in the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that he wasn't backing down. The meeting ended shortly after, but the exchange left its mark. The CEO knew that, despite the small victories, the fight was far from over. The world he lived in was still one where people like him had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. And he wasn't about to stop. He had proven himself once again, but the battle was still unfolding, and he was ready for whatever came next. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and endless decisions that demanded his attention, but the CEO couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The encounter with the investors had left him unsettled, not because of the doubts they had expressed, but because of the way their comments had lingered in his mind. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about a system that was built to question his legitimacy at every turn, no matter how many successes he achieved. On a late afternoon, as he was walking out of the building, heading toward his car, he spotted Richard again, one of the lead investors who had thrown the most subtle, yet cutting, doubts his way during the meeting. Richard was standing near his car, talking to a colleague, and as soon as he saw the CEO, he stopped mid-sentence. His posture stiffened for a brief moment, as if he hadn't expected to see him here, in this moment, in this position of power. The CEO paused, sensing the tension before Richard finally smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We didn't get a chance to chat earlier," Richard said, his voice smooth but laced with the kind of politeness that felt more condescending than sincere. "I've been thinking about your proposals, and I'm not entirely convinced about the direction you're taking." The CEO's heart didn't race, his thoughts were calm. He had dealt with worse. He had been questioned by many family members, colleagues, even strangers who assumed he was just the face of someone else's work. He had learned to rise above it, but this time it felt personal. Richard wasn't just questioning his leadership, he was questioning his very worth. "I understand," the CEO replied, his voice firm, unyielding. "I know it's hard for some to accept that a black man can lead a company like mine. But let me make one thing clear, I am not here to be the exception. I'm here because I am the rule. My success isn't because I got lucky, and it's not because of any handout. It's because I worked harder than anyone else in this room, and I've earned my place at the table." Richard's face faltered for a split second, a hint of discomfort flickering across his features before he masked it with a neutral expression. "You're quite confident for someone who hasn't been in this industry long," he said, trying to steer the conversation into safer territory. "You have a long way to go." The CEO met his gaze without flinching. "I've already gone further than you think. And I'm just getting started." There was a moment of silence before Richard nodded, clearly unsure of how to respond. The CEO turned and walked toward his car, the weight of Richard's words still hanging in the air, but he refused to let them settle. He knew this wasn't just about a few misguided comments, it was about the prejudice that existed beneath the surface, the kind that wasn't always spoken but was always felt. This was a challenge he would continue to face, but it wasn't one he was afraid of. As he got into his car and drove away, the city skyline looming in the distance, the CEO knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. But he was prepared. He had built his empire on overcoming obstacles, and this fight was no different. The world might doubt him, but he would not be swayed. He would keep pushing forward, and he would do it on his terms, because the one thing he knew for sure was that the only limits were the ones people tried to impose on him. The next few weeks were a blur of high-stakes negotiations, press appearances, and strategic decisions that left little room for personal reflection, but the CEO could not shake the feeling that the challenges he faced were growing ever more personal. The subtle prejudice that had followed him since the beginning of his career now seemed to be intensifying, and with each passing day, it felt as though every success came with an asterisk, a reminder that despite his achievements, the world was still not ready to accept him as truly equal. On one particularly busy afternoon, he found himself at the company's headquarters preparing for another critical presentation. This one was different, however. It was not just a pitch to investors, it was a presentation to the company's board members, the people who held the power to approve his vision for the future. As the CEO walked into the boardroom, he noticed the familiar faces of the board members, most of whom were white, all seated at the long, polished table. The atmosphere in the room felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to stumble. As he took his seat at the head of the table, he saw that Richard, the lead investor from his previous meeting, was among the board members. Richard looked at him with a strange mix of curiosity and skepticism, as though he were waiting to see how long the CEO could keep this up. The CEO took a deep breath and began his presentation, outlining his plans for the next phase of the company's growth. He spoke with the same calm confidence he always did, laying out the numbers, the projections, and the strategies. Yet, with every word he spoke, he could feel the weight of their gaze, a pressure that seemed to grow heavier as he continued. It was in moments like these that the CEO realized just how much he was fighting against, not just the expectations of the business world, but the deep-rooted biases that made his every move feel like a test. As he reached the section of the presentation that dealt with diversity initiatives, he noticed a slight shift in the room. The air seemed to thicken as Richard cleared his throat. "You've spoken a lot about inclusion and diversity," Richard said, his tone polite but pointed, "but how exactly does that fit into the company's bottom line? Can you prove that these initiatives will actually translate into growth?" The question was loaded. It wasn't just about the numbers, it was about whether the CEO was actually worthy of the position he had earned, whether his identity was a distraction to their vision. The CEO could feel the old familiar sting of being questioned in a way that no one else ever seemed to be. His stomach tightened, but he didn't show it. "Diversity and inclusion are not just a trend," the CEO said firmly, meeting Richard's gaze without blinking. "They are the foundation of innovation. Our team is stronger because it represents different perspectives, and that diversity has already led to breakthroughs in product development, customer engagement, and employee retention. The numbers will speak for themselves." There was a pause in the room. Some of the board members exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The CEO held his ground, aware that this moment was more than just about business, it was about proving that his leadership was not defined by his race, but by his ability to lead, innovate, and inspire. After a tense silence, one of the other board members, a woman named Karen, spoke up. "I agree with the CEO," she said, looking around the table. "Diversity is a proven driver of success, and I think we need to take that into account when evaluating his strategy." The shift was subtle, but it was there. The CEO knew that his words had made an impact, but it wasn't a complete victory, not yet. As the meeting wrapped up and he walked out of the room, he felt a small sense of triumph. It wasn't the kind of victory that would silence his critics, but it was a step forward. It was another reminder that no matter how high they stacked the odds against him, he would always rise to meet them. After the meeting with the board, the CEO felt a brief sense of accomplishment, but it didn't last long. The tension that had been building in the company over the past few weeks was becoming undeniable. Despite his success in pushing the diversity agenda forward and securing the next phase of funding, there were still whispers behind closed doors, comments made in private meetings, emails exchanged under the radar, and looks of discomfort when he entered a room. He knew that the true test of his leadership was not just about winning meetings or securing deals. It was about maintaining control and integrity in an environment that was actively trying to undermine him. A few days later, the CEO was scheduled to attend a major industry conference, one that attracted the top influencers, executives, and investors from across the globe. This was an opportunity for him to network, showcase his company's successes, and, most importantly, continue breaking down the barriers that still existed for black leaders in the corporate world. As he arrived at the venue, he was immediately hit by the stark contrast between the atmosphere and the reality he was facing. The venue was grand, filled with wealthy white business elites, and it felt like a world that was still not fully ready to accept someone like him. He walked through the crowd with purpose, nodding at familiar faces, but there was always that underlying awareness of how different he was from everyone else in the room. His arrival had not gone unnoticed. Several executives, who had worked with him in the past, greeted him politely but with a certain distance. They were all smiles, but there was something in their eyes that made it clear they didn't fully see him as a peer. He could sense it. He had always been able to read people, to gauge their comfort or discomfort, and today, that discomfort was palpable. He made his way to the stage for the panel discussion where he was scheduled to speak, his mind focused on the task at hand. This was his moment to show that he was not just another token leader, but a legitimate force in the industry. As he took his seat, he looked around at the panelists. They were all white men, and as the event began, he couldn't help but notice how they all seemed to speak with a certain level of authority that was never questioned. When his turn came to speak, he leaned into the microphone with the same calm confidence he had carried through countless boardrooms. The future of business, he began, is not about maintaining the status quo. It's about disruption, innovation, and inclusivity. The best ideas come from people who bring diverse perspectives, and the companies that will lead in the next decade will be the ones that understand the value of true diversity not just in hiring practices, but in leadership, strategy, and culture. The words came out smoothly, but he could tell that some of the other panelists were uncomfortable. Richard, who had been sitting in the front row, shifted in his seat, and one of the other panelists, a senior executive from a competing firm, raised an eyebrow at him. "You're suggesting that the future of business is about diversity?" the executive asked, his tone skeptical, as if the idea was outlandish. "How do you plan to reconcile that with the pressure to deliver results? Are we talking about social justice, or are we talking about profits?" The question was loaded, and the CEO could feel the familiar sting of being questioned in a way that no one else on that panel ever would be. But he was ready. "We are talking about both," he said firmly, meeting the executive's gaze. "You cannot separate social responsibility from profitability. In fact, the most successful companies in the world are the ones that have embraced diversity, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes good business sense. It drives innovation, fosters loyalty, and opens doors to new markets." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "If you're not willing to evolve, to challenge the status quo, then you're already losing. And that's something I won't allow to happen." The room was quiet for a moment, and then the murmurs began. Richard nodded slowly, though his expression remained tight. The CEO knew he hadn't fully won them over, but he also knew that his words had made an impact. As the panel discussion ended, he stepped off the stage, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over, but he was more certain than ever that he was on the right path. It was going to take more than just speaking out to change the industry. It would take real action, real commitment, and the unwavering determination to keep pushing, no matter how hard the resistance. As he walked through the crowd after the event, he could feel the eyes on him again. But this time, there was something different in the air, an uncertainty, a shift. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see him for who he truly was. Weeks passed, and the CEO felt the pressure mounting. Despite the small victories, like the positive reactions after his panel discussion and the minor shifts in boardroom dynamics, there were still constant reminders that the fight was far from over. Every day, he found himself facing new hurdles, new moments where his legitimacy as a leader was questioned, often in ways that felt less overt but just as damaging. One such moment came during a quarterly meeting with the senior leadership team, where the CEO was expected to provide updates on the company's performance. He had spent days preparing for this, carefully crafting every presentation slide, ensuring that each data point told a compelling story. The meeting began like any other, with the team reviewing financials and progress on major initiatives. However, as soon as he began to discuss the company's efforts to expand its diversity initiatives, a shift occurred. One of the senior leaders, Thomas, who had always been a bit resistant to the CEO's push for diversity, raised his hand mid-presentation. "I think we need to reconsider this emphasis on diversity," Thomas said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "I mean, we're here to grow the business, not to meet some social quota. What matters is the bottom line." The words were casual, but the underlying sentiment was clear. It was the same argument he had heard time and time again, that diversity and inclusion were distractions from the real work, that they were somehow less important than profit margins or market share. The CEO paused, allowing the room to settle. His pulse quickened, but his expression remained calm. He had heard this argument before, from other colleagues, from investors, from people who refused to believe that diversity could be a driver of success. But it was one thing to hear it from an outsider, it was another to hear it from within his own company, from someone who was supposed to be on his team. "Thomas," the CEO began, his voice steady but firm, "I understand your concern, but this is not about quotas. It's about creating an environment where every single person in this company feels valued and can bring their full self to work. When people feel included, they perform better. They innovate. They are more invested in the company's success. This isn't just a nice to have, it's a business imperative." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room was holding its breath. Thomas looked down at his notes, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't challenge the CEO further. However, the tension in the room was palpable. The rest of the leadership team remained silent, some looking uncomfortable, others appearing unsure. It was clear that this conversation was one they were not used to having. The CEO pressed on, continuing to explain how diversity had played a pivotal role in the company's most recent successes. He shared case studies, numbers, and examples from their competitors, demonstrating how companies that embraced diversity were outperforming their counterparts in nearly every metric. But as he spoke, he could feel the eyes on him, the skepticism that still lingered. It was as if he had to prove himself all over again, even to those who had been with him from the beginning. By the end of the meeting, Thomas remained silent, but the air in the room was thick with unspoken words. The CEO knew that the road ahead was going to require more than just convincing the people in this room. It was going to require changing minds, breaking down barriers, and challenging the deeply ingrained biases that existed not only in the industry but within his own company. As the meeting adjourned and the leadership team filed out of the room, the CEO stayed behind, staring at the presentation slides he had prepared. He could feel the weight of the conversation pressing on him, but he also knew that he could not afford to back down. He had come too far, fought too hard to be here, and there was still much work to be done. As he gathered his things and left the conference room, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This battle was far from over, but he was not going to stop. Not now, not ever. The next few weeks were filled with more meetings, more struggles, and more subtle challenges, but the CEO remained focused. The doubts and resistance from some of the senior leadership team had not gone unnoticed, but he refused to be distracted by them. Every interaction, every decision, every comment he made, he was aware of the burden that came with being a black CEO in a space that was not designed for people like him. Despite his accomplishments, despite the progress he had made, the underlying current of bias remained strong. However, there was no turning back now. One day, as he was sitting in his office, reviewing the latest market analysis and company projections, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Davis, you have a call on line 1. It's Richard." The CEO's mind immediately went to the last conversation he had with Richard, the lead investor. Richard had been the one to express doubt during their last major meeting, his subtle, condescending comments still echoing in his mind. The CEO took a deep breath before answering the call. "Richard, how are you?" he said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Good, good," Richard replied, his voice warm but guarded. "I wanted to check in with you and see how everything is going. The board is happy with the progress, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the future." The CEO could hear the underlying tension in Richard's words. He knew Richard was trying to navigate the delicate balance of supporting him without fully committing, still unsure of how far he could push the diversity agenda. "Everything is going well," the CEO replied, carefully choosing his words. "We are moving forward with the plans, and I'm confident that the company will continue to thrive." The diversity initiatives are an integral part of that. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The CEO knew Richard well enough to understand that he was weighing his response. "I've been thinking about your diversity initiatives," Richard said finally, his tone more measured now. "I see the value in it, but I'm still not sure how it aligns with the company's long-term strategy. We need to be careful that we don't overextend ourselves, you know? There's a lot of pressure on the bottom line." The CEO leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Richard's doubts were not new, but they were becoming more persistent. "I understand your concern," the CEO said, his voice steady, "but let me be clear. Diversity is not just a nice-to-have. It's a competitive advantage. Companies that embrace it are more innovative, more adaptable, and more resilient. It's not about charity, it's about business." He paused, letting the words settle. "And the bottom line will follow. You can't measure success by profits alone. It's about the people, the culture, the way we build and create together. If we ignore that, we will be left behind." There was another long pause before Richard spoke again. "I see your point, and I don't want to stand in the way of progress," he said, his tone softer now, but still cautious. "I'll talk to the rest of the board and see if we can align on this. I just want to make sure we're being realistic." "I appreciate that," the CEO replied, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't about being realistic, it's about being visionary. We can either move forward with the future in mind, or we can keep looking backwards. The choice is ours." Richard hesitated before responding. "I'll let you know what the board says. But keep me updated on your progress." "I will," the CEO said, ending the call. He sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the city skyline. Another battle had been fought, and while it wasn't a victory, it wasn't a loss either. He had made his case. He had stood firm. Now it was time to wait. He knew that the road ahead was long, but he was more determined than ever. The world might not be ready for a black CEO. But he wasn't here to wait for permission. He was here to make his mark, and he would not let anyone, no matter how powerful, stop him. The following week, the CEO sat in his office, reviewing the latest board meeting notes, but his mind kept drifting back to the conversation he had had with Richard. The call had left him with a sense of uncertainty. While Richard had not outright rejected the CEO's vision, there was still that underlying hesitation, the belief that diversity was something nice to talk about but not necessarily a business priority. The CEO knew that this was a crucial moment. He had come so far, fought so many battles to get to this point, and yet, there was still the constant challenge of proving that he, as a black CEO, could lead the company to greater success. Despite the pressure, he refused to back down. The fight for legitimacy, for equality, was not just for himself, it was for everyone who had been held back by the limitations of race and expectation. It was on this principle that he forged ahead, determined to prove that his leadership, and the leadership of people like him, was exactly what the company needed. As he was lost in thought, his assistant knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Davis, you have a visitor." "It's Karen from the board," she said. The CEO straightened in his chair, surprised by the unexpected visit. Karen had been one of the few board members who had shown genuine support for his diversity initiatives, even during the tougher moments. She had stood up for him in meetings when others had questioned his approach. The CEO had a feeling this visit wasn't going to be about business as usual. When Karen entered the office, she immediately closed the door behind her, her expression serious. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she began, sitting down across from him. "I've been hearing a lot of murmurs around the company lately. There's a divide, and it's only growing. Some of the senior leadership team are still unsure about the direction you're taking, especially with the emphasis on diversity and inclusion." The CEO nodded, already aware of the tension within the team. He had expected this. "I've been hearing the same," he said calmly. "But we've made progress. The initiatives are working. Our numbers are up, our retention rates are improving, and we're attracting more diverse talent than ever before." "I know," Karen replied, her tone softening. "I've seen the data, and I believe in what you're doing. But it's not just about the data, is it? There's a deeper issue here, one that's harder to quantify. The resistance you're facing, it's not just about strategy or bottom lines. It's about something much bigger. It's about the fact that you're a black man leading a company that, in many ways, has never truly embraced leadership from someone like you. The word stung, but the CEO didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He had felt it in every meeting, in every encounter that was laced with doubt. But Karen's honesty was different. It wasn't an accusation, it was a recognition of the truth. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, he said after a long pause. But I didn't get here by taking the easy path. I've always known that I'd have to work twice as hard to prove myself. And that's fine. Because I'm ready to fight for my seat at this table. Karen nodded, her eyes meeting his. I believe in you, I really do, she said. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. The resistance is not going to disappear. It's going to get louder, and it's going to come from unexpected places. Some people will never accept you, no matter what you achieve. The CEO leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling in. He had always known that the fight would never be over, that he would always face people who would try to hold him back. But he had also learned that these challenges only fueled his determination. I'm not backing down, he said firmly. This is my vision. This is my leadership. And I'm going to prove that it's not just the right choice, it's the only choice. Karen sat in silence for a moment, studying his face, before giving a slight nod of approval. I'm with you, she said quietly, but you need to be ready for the battle. It's going to be hard, but you can win it. Just don't let them break you. As Karen left his office, the CEO sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on her words. He knew the road ahead would be rocky. He knew that every success would come with its own set of challenges. But as he looked out over the city from his office window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had built this company from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. Not now. Not ever. The CEO's resolve had never been stronger, but as the weeks continued to pass, he could feel the weight of the battle growing heavier. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge, whether it was from a skeptical board member or an industry veteran questioning his leadership. Despite his successes, the whispers never seemed to fade. But what he hadn't anticipated was the shift that started happening in the office. Employees, those who had quietly supported him from the beginning, were beginning to speak out. A few weeks after his conversation with Karen, he was walking through the hallways when one of his junior executives, Maya, approached him. She was a young woman, bright and ambitious, someone who had worked under his leadership for several years now. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I wanted to talk to you about something. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, but there was also a fire there, something different from the usual nerves. Of course, Maya. What's on your mind? It's about the culture in the office, she said, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of people who are upset. They don't think the company is moving in the right direction, especially with all the focus on diversity and inclusion. The CEO's stomach tightened. He had suspected that the tension was building, but hearing it from someone who worked so closely with him brought it into sharp focus. Tell me more, he said, his tone calm but attentive. Maya glanced down, clearly struggling with the weight of what she was about to say. It's not just about the policies. It's about you. People are questioning whether you're qualified to lead. They don't think a black man should be in charge of a company like this. Some of them won't say it to your face, but I've overheard things that shouldn't be said, especially not in this office. The word stung, but the CEO held his composure. He had been hearing these things in one form or another for years. He had grown used to the whispers, the sideways glances, and the quiet dismissals. But hearing it from someone like Maya, someone he had mentored and trusted, hit him differently. Maya, he said, his voice steady, thank you for telling me. I know this company isn't perfect. I know there are people who feel uncomfortable with the changes we're making. But what I can tell you is that I'm here because I've earned my place. I've worked harder than anyone, and I've fought to get to this point. And the work we're doing to make this company more inclusive, more diverse, that's what's going to make us stronger, not weaker. Maya nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I know, Mr. Davis. I believe in what you're doing. But it's hard when the people around you don't. The CEO paused, taking a deep breath. He had been in this position before, where it felt like everything he did was met with resistance, where every step forward was followed by 2 steps back. But he wasn't going to let it break him, not now. I won't let them stop me, Maya, he said firmly. This company is mine, and it will be stronger for it. And you know what? I'm not going to let anyone tell me I don't belong here, not now, not ever. I will keep pushing, and I will keep proving that the changes we're making are the right ones. You stay with me, and we'll get there together. Maya looked up at him, her eyes softening. I'll stay, Mr. Davis, she said quietly. I'm with you. As Maya walked away, the CEO stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling. The fight was far from over. He could feel it in his bones, the resistance, the doubt, the people who didn't want to see a black man succeed in this role. But he also felt something else, something stronger, the unshakable certainty that he was on the right path. The company was changing, and no matter how many people doubted him, he was going to make sure that it succeeded. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but he had already overcome so much. He could keep going. He would keep going. The CEO's days were becoming more intense as the pressure from both within and outside the company escalated. The resistance he faced was no longer just from a few individuals, it was now a wave of quiet defiance that seemed to permeate the entire organization. The comments and side glances had grown more frequent, and while some employees whispered in hallways, others began to question his leadership in more open settings. Despite all of this, the CEO refused to let it break his focus. He had built this company from the ground up, and no matter how many people doubted him, he would not back down. On one particular afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest market trends and financial reports, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Davis, Karen is here to see you, his assistant said. Karen, the board member who had stood by him from the beginning, had been one of the few who truly understood the vision he was trying to implement, especially in regard to diversity and inclusion. She had been a quiet ally, and the CEO appreciated her support more than she probably knew. Send her in, he replied, straightening up in his chair. Karen entered, her expression serious, as always, but there was something in her eyes, something that told the CEO that this conversation wasn't going to be like the others. Is everything okay? He asked, concerned. Karen closed the door behind her and sat down across from him. Not really, she said, her voice low. I've been hearing more and more murmurs from the board and the senior leadership team. There are people who are questioning whether you're really the right person to lead this company. They're worried that your focus on diversity is diverting attention from the bottom line. The words hit him harder than he had expected. For months, he had fought to prove that his vision wasn't just about social justice, it was about strengthening the company, creating long-term value, and positioning them for success in a rapidly changing world. But now, it seemed like all that hard work, all the progress he had made, was being undermined. Who exactly is saying this? The CEO asked, his voice calm but his anger simmering beneath the surface. Karen hesitated for a moment before answering. It's not just one person, but several. They're afraid that you're pushing too hard on the diversity front, and that it's starting to take away from the company's primary goal, profit. The CEO took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had known that there would be resistance, but hearing that it was coming from within his own team, the very people who were supposed to support him, was a blow. I've been fighting for this from the very beginning, he said, his voice steady. And I've always believed that diversity isn't just a moral issue, it's a business one. Diverse teams are more innovative, more creative, and they outperform homogeneous ones. This is not about taking resources away from our bottom line, it's about strengthening the company in ways that no one else has seen yet. Karen nodded, but there was a sadness in her expression. I know that, and I believe in you. But the board and the leadership team, they're not all on the same page. They don't understand the long-term impact of what you're trying to do. The silence between them stretched on for a few moments, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Finally, the CEO spoke, his voice firm and resolute. I'm not giving up on this. I didn't get here by backing down, and I'm not going to start now. If they want me to choose between doing what's right and doing what's easy, then they can find someone else. But I'm not going anywhere. Karen looked at him, her expression a mix of concern and respect. I know you won't give up. But you need to be ready for the backlash. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I've been prepared for this, he said, standing up and walking toward the window, looking out over the city skyline. This is what it takes to change things. It's not easy, and it's not going to be quick. But I'm not backing down. Karen stood up, walking toward the door. I'm with you, she said quietly. And I'll continue to support you, but you're going to have to fight for every inch. As she left, the CEO stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had known this day would come, the day when the pressure would become unbearable, when those closest to him would question his decisions, when his leadership would be scrutinized more than ever. But he was ready. He had come too far, fought too hard to be where he was, and there was no turning back. He was determined to make his mark on this company, and no matter how many people tried to hold him back, he would keep pushing forward. This was his vision, and he would fight for it until the very end. The following weeks proved to be some of the most challenging the CEO had faced. Despite his unwavering resolve, the pushback from the board and senior leadership team grew stronger. At every turn, there were more questions, more doubts, and more resistance to his leadership style, particularly when it came to his commitment to diversity and inclusion. It seemed that for every small victory he gained in the boardroom, there were 2 more setbacks waiting to happen. One afternoon, as the CEO prepared for another contentious board meeting, he found himself alone in his office, reflecting on everything he had fought for. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Maya, the young executive who had been one of his biggest supporters. She wanted to meet with him. He couldn't help but wonder what it was about. Maya had always been an ally, someone who had truly bought into his vision for the company. But lately, he had noticed a shift in her behavior. She seemed more withdrawn, more hesitant, like she was feeling the pressure from the higher-ups. The CEO cleared his desk and called her into his office. When she walked in, he could see the concern in her eyes. Mr. Davis, she said, sitting down across from him, I need to be honest with you. The atmosphere in the office has gotten even worse. People are talking behind your back, questioning everything, your leadership, the direction you're taking the company. It's like there's this unspoken agreement to undermine you at every turn. The CEO's heart sank. He had known things weren't easy, but hearing it so directly from someone who was on the inside, who had worked with him so closely, hit him harder than he expected. Tell me everything, Maya, he said, his voice calm, though the weight of her words was beginning to press on him. I don't know who is saying it, but the general consensus is that you're too focused on social issues, Maya continued, looking down at her hands. People think the company should be focused purely on profitability, on growth, and not all this talk about diversity and inclusion. They're saying it's distracting from the real work. I've heard it from a few senior leaders. And some of the other staff are starting to feel the same way. The CEO leaned back in his chair, processing the information. He had been anticipating this. He had known that the resistance would come from all sides, but to hear it from his own employees, the ones who were supposed to be on his side, was a bitter pill to swallow. He had fought so hard to build a culture of inclusion, a place where people from all backgrounds could feel valued and heard. Yet here he was, facing an insidious form of resistance that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. Maya, he said, after a long pause, I've known this day was coming. It's never been easy, but I'm not backing down. I didn't get here by being silent. I got here by standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. And I'm not going to stop now. Maya nodded slowly, though she still looked worried. I know you won't, Mr. Davis. But I'm scared. I'm scared that all this pressure is going to break you, and I don't want to see you go through that. You've done so much for this company. You've made it better, stronger, more inclusive. But it's like there's this invisible barrier, and no matter how hard you push, they won't let you in. The CEO felt the weight of her words. She was right. No matter how hard he tried to move the company forward, no matter how many wins he scored, there was always that invisible line, that barrier of prejudice, that kept pushing him back. But he had never been one to shy away from a fight.
I understand, Maya. I really do.
But this is the world we live in.
People are going to push back. They're going to question everything I do, because they don't want to see a black man lead a company like this.
But that's exactly why I can't stop. If I give up now, I'm telling them they were right.
And I'm not about to do that.
He paused, looking out the window at the city below.
This is my fight. And I'm going to finish it.
Maya sat in silence for a moment, then stood up, a sense of determination returning to her face.
I'm with you, Mr. Davis. I believe in you, and I'll keep fighting with you. I
just needed you to know how bad it's getting. As she walked out of the office, the CEO sat for a long while, staring at the skyline. He knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but he also knew that he couldn't let anyone take this from him. He had come too far, fought too hard.
The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning.
The CEO spent the next several days in a whirlwind of meetings, emails, and calls. Despite the mounting pressure and the resistance that seemed to grow with each passing day, his resolve only strengthened. He had been prepared for the long fight, but what he had not anticipated was how deeply the challenges would affect him. Each small victory felt like a momentary triumph, but the doubts and the prejudice never seemed to fade, hovering over every decision he made. Yet, he could not afford to let those doubts take root. He had worked too hard, fought too long to get here. One afternoon, he found himself once again in a meeting with the board, where tensions were running higher than ever. Richard, the lead investor who had long questioned his leadership, was sitting across the table from him. The familiar skepticism in his eyes was unmistakable. The room was thick with the kind of quiet hostility that the CEO had grown used to, but it was no longer intimidating. He had faced worse.
He had overcome worse.
Mr. Davis, Richard began, his tone clipped, the progress we've made under your leadership is commendable, but we need to be honest about the direction we're going. The focus on diversity and inclusion, while important, is starting to take resources away from the core business. I'm concerned that the company is losing its edge, its competitive advantage. The words stung, but the CEO had been expecting them. He knew that the board was divided, and he knew that his focus on diversity had become a point of contention for many.
But this time, he wasn't going to back down.
Richard, with all due respect, the CEO said, his voice steady but firm, you're missing the point. Diversity is not a diversion, it's a competitive edge. Companies that embrace diverse perspectives are more innovative, more adaptable, and more resilient.
If you're not willing to evolve with the times, then you're already behind.
There was a slight shift in
the room, a subtle change in the atmosphere. For a brief moment, the CEO could feel the weight of the words landing.
But Richard wasn't backing down either.
We need to see the results, Davis, Richard replied, his tone hardening. The numbers.
You've promised that diversity will lead to increased productivity, but so far, we're not seeing that.
The CEO leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. I've always said that diversity is not just a moral obligation, it's a business imperative. And we are seeing the results.
Our retention rates are up, our talent pool is broader, and we're attracting new clients who value our commitment to inclusivity.
It's not going to happen overnight, but the trajectory is clear.
Richard looked at him, unconvinced. The CEO could see the skepticism in his eyes, but he refused to let it shake him. He had spent too long in this position to back down now. I didn't come this far to give up now, the CEO said, his voice growing more intense.
This company is mine.
I built it, and I will lead it into the future, no matter how many people try to pull it back.
If you can't see the vision, then maybe you're in the wrong room.
The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable. But then, something unexpected happened. Karen, the board member who had been one of his strongest allies, spoke up. I think it's time we stop questioning the CEO's leadership, she said, her voice firm but calm.
We've seen the numbers. We've seen the progress.
And it's clear that the changes he's making are working. Maybe it's time for us to embrace this vision fully, instead of continually undermining it. The room fell silent.
The shift in Karen's tone was undeniable.
Slowly, others around the table began to nod in agreement. The CEO could feel a slight shift in the dynamic, a subtle yet important change. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step forward. After the meeting adjourned, the CEO sat in his office, alone for the first time in hours. He looked out the window at the city skyline, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. The fight was far from over, but something had changed. The resistance, while still present, had begun to shift. Maybe it was the persistence of his vision, or maybe it was the slowly growing understanding that his approach was not just about being right, it was about leading the company into a future that was more inclusive, more adaptable, and ultimately, more successful. Whatever it was, he knew that he was no longer alone in this fight. The path ahead would still be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that victory might actually be within reach.